Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Dr. Simon Zadek on the topic of the sustainable financial system. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week on the show, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international affairs, or international public policy. Today, my guest is Dr. Simon Zadek. He is the co-director of the UNEP Inquiry. Among his many other affiliations, he is a senior fellow at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He's on the advisory board of the Generation Investment Management Group, and he is a senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Welcome to the show, Simon.
Thank you, Andrew.
Before we get into the UNEP project, I wonder if you could say a little bit about your previous work with CG. I understand you were brought on earlier to be part of the advisory group for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's UN panel on global sustainability. Could you say a little bit about that work?
Sure, yeah. So in the run-up to Rio +20,
right.
UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon established one of what then turned out to be a number of different high-level panels. This one entitled the Global Sustainability Panel. In fact, your chairman, Jim Balsillie, was the private sector representative on the panel. And so I was drawn in to support Jim's work, in fact. And Jim's job was to not represent the interests of business, but to try and bring thinking from the business community and economics, I guess,
right.
into the discussions of the panel. Interestingly, my main contribution and Jim's main pitch, if you like, on the panel concerned the subject that we're going to talk about for the rest of the half hour, which is, he argued the case that financial markets were a key part of the solution, that financial markets had flaws that rendered them unable to serve the interests of the sustainability agenda,
right.
and that reform was needed. And in fact, some of that went into Ban Ki-moon's eventual report by the panel, but perhaps it wasn't the right moment in time.
Right. So just building on that, why now then? Why is UNEP all of a sudden interested in this issue?
Yeah, so firstly, what's the issue?
Right.
So the UNEP Inquiry was set up at the beginning of this year to really ask and try and answer one question. How can the financial system be better aligned to the needs of sustainable development? What does that
right.
mean in practice?
Okay.
How can one influence the way in which credit is created and capital allocated in a way that takes account of environmental and broader sustainability effects of those financial flows? What's the situation at the moment? Well, capital markets are perhaps $270, $275 trillion globally. We see environmental damage continuing apace, whether you look at climate data, whether you look at air pollution in Beijing, whether you look at desertification across parts of Africa,
right.
and so on. And we see a continued flow of particularly private capital into assets that make the situation worse. If you look at the carbon intensity, say, of stock exchanges around
right.
the world, which can be measured, far from that intensity going down, over the last 5 years, in exactly the same period that awareness around climate change has become greater, the intensity has gone up.
Right.
If we look at investments in fossil fuel exploration and extraction, we see it running at 2, 3, 4 times the level of annual clean tech investment. So we have a financial system that is, for a whole range of different reasons, flowing funds into, if you like, the wrong answer.
Right.
And an answer that ultimately, will damage the economy, will damage people who depend on the economy, and will feed back and damage the financial system itself. It's just it'll happen in a while, if you like. And so those things are not news, actually. So the question becomes, why now? Which is really to your point. And I think there are several specifics that are at play. I think one is that the financial crisis of 2008 and its very complicated aftermath, which is still playing itself out, has sowed a level of distrust in the financial community and a resounding belief that in its current form it is not fit for purpose. And you get folks like the managing director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, two of the most mainstream representatives of the international governance of the financial system, both publicly arguing that the financial system today is not fit for purpose. So this is not just a Greenpeace story, if you like. And so it's a moment in time where the immediate crisis has passed, so we're not trying to save our necks on a minute-by-minute basis. But the distrust and sense of the need for change is very much still present. So that would be one. The second would be that despite 2 decades of work around trying to increase green finance flows, whether it be from banks or investments through capital markets or green insurance products, although there's been much innovation and very interesting experimentation, that the level of green finance flows remains pathetic, I would say, pathetically low compared to the numbers that are needed. If you reckon we need something in the order of $5 to $6 trillion a year in investment in infrastructure globally, that's everything kind of all in. First of all, we're not meeting that number even before you get to the green equation. We're nowhere close to it. So there's a kind of long-term infrastructure investment gap in any case. Secondly, much of that investment is still natural resource and carbon intensive. And so we're kind of investing in stuff that's going to crumble in the face of climate change, is going to exacerbate the environmental problems we have, is not going to serve our needs over 2, 3, 4, 5 decades that we need that stuff to do what is required. And thirdly, I guess, so you've got not a lot of green finance, a financial crisis that has left a bad taste and a desire for larger scale change. And I guess thirdly, you've got a change in the nature of leadership. And obviously we see that in many different contexts. But I think, and we'll come on to this perhaps later in the discussion, I think we begin to see emerging markets in particular, China, Brazil, South Africa, perhaps a little less so, India, much less so, Russia, Bangladesh, Indonesia, all showing an appetite for shaping financial markets differently, that is perhaps not as present in more matured OECD financial markets and their respective central banks and regulators. So, financial crisis, not enough green finance, continuation and exacerbation of the problem, and perhaps some leadership changes, all of which combines not to guarantee a good result, but to perhaps offer a moment in time, a kind of window of opportunity to shift the financial system towards something that will serve our interests better.
Is there grounds to be skeptical, though, in the sense that, the Brundtland Commission from the late 80s first coined the phrase sustainable development. The last few years have shown just how volatile and fragile the global economic system is. How do you respond to the critics who say that sustainability is a luxury that the system just can't afford right now?
Well, let's start at the beginning. Are there grounds to be skeptical? Absolutely yes. But skepticism is a very healthy part of the human condition. Cynicism, perhaps, is more of a problem. Actually, are there grounds to be fearful? I would say much more so. And anyone who isn't fearful really should take a visit to their local doctor, because the conditions are not good, as we know it. But I think the underlying question is, are there grounds for hope that change is possible? And then linking it into your final point, does it make equal sense for different countries? Countries at different stages of development. And that obviously depends partly whether one's talking about a lack of potable water or a long-term climate agenda, and how one kind of compares the two. So I think anyone who took a view that there is simply no problem in moving the financial sector to a better place, is probably being what in English one would describe as Pollyannish, slightly abstract in their thinking and perhaps overly and indulgently idealistic. But I think the possibility is there. So I think in that sense, skepticism is right, but hopelessness is wrong. I think we begin to see changes that some central bankers and financial regulators and financial institutions and ministries of finance are beginning to make. So, for example, the UNEP Inquiry, which is now operating in 15 different countries to try and understand what the experience of those countries is in trying to bring the environmental agenda into the rules governing the financial system. One of the countries that we're working in is China, by no means the cleanest country in the world.
No.
But interestingly, we have a high-level alliance with the People's Bank of China, which is the Chinese central bank. It's a green finance task force involving probably 100 different organizations, mainly from the major cities in China, involving different parts of government, different parts of the regulatory community, financial institutions, stock exchanges, credit rating agencies, accounting bodies, and is currently looking at 14 major themes for advancing green finance in China. Why?
Right.
Why? I think the why is clear, which is perhaps in the past one would have argued that China was most threatened by a slowdown in its rate of economic growth, whereas today one might argue it is perhaps even more threatened by toxicity of the soil and the food that they eat, a growing water crisis, which is encroaching upon the possibility of urban living, and air pollution, which is killing people's children, whether rich or poor, and creating huge public health challenges going forward. If you're working for a central bank and you're sitting in Beijing today, and you compare it to perhaps a central banker sitting in London or New York or elsewhere, you look out of the window, and what do you see? You see the very air that is destroying your family and potentially undermining China's long-term development possibility. And so you sit there not thinking, I don't really have this job to do, this is the job of the Ministry of Environmental Protection. Instead you sit there and go, I need to be part of that solution. The question is, what? And so a task force is created to try and understand what can one do as a central banker? What can one do as the China Banking Regulatory Commission? What can one do as the Shanghai Stock Exchange or an Institute of Standardization? But that doesn't mean that nothing is happening in OECD countries. I think it would be wrong to sort of oversimplify in that way. And perhaps one of the most interesting examples actually figuring in the Financial Times today is that Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, obviously of Canadian descent,
of course,
today came out with a second round view on how he sees climate as potentially representing a risk to the stability of the financial system. At the recent IMF World Bank meetings in Washington, D.C., he came out and announced that he had initiated a prudential review of the UK insurance sector. And in effect today he was coming out and announcing that he was going to extend that prudential review to begin looking at how climate risk might influence the stability of other parts of the financial sector, including the banking community, obviously a kind of major piece of the story. Now, that's a very interesting development. He is the first governor of a major central bank to, in a sense, initiate a macroprudential review, a kind of financial stability review of the effect of environment on the financial system. But there's no doubt that there are a growing number of financial regulators and central bankers around the world who are thinking about the same thing, and I'm sure will be inspired by Mark Carney's leadership, who of course also chairs the Financial Stability Committee, Financial Stability Board. Another example, from perhaps a different place, the US, again sticking within the OECD, S&P Rating Services, the credit rating agency, perhaps not the most loved organization in the world at this point, given kind of where they sat within the process of the financial crisis. Yeah, they are the first major credit rating agency to begin to integrate climate risk into sovereign credit debt. Yeah, and you have to think sovereign debt today is of the order of $70 trillion. Yeah, it's a large piece of our capital markets, and so if only a small portion of that debt is materially influenced in terms of the cost of capital by new metrics looking at climate-related risk, that will move many sovereign states to begin thinking differently about the way in which they approach climate, because it's affecting their access to international capital markets and the cost of capital that they can secure.
Right.
So it's very real, I guess, is the point. One isn't starting with a deductive proposition that change is needed and then trying to work out logically what set of changes would make most sense. I think one's starting with a deductive view that change is needed, but beginning to see, if you like, a quiet revolution of changes that are happening in different parts of the world, but haven't yet kind of crystallized into a, oh my goodness, actually one can move the system to another place, and there are real examples of where that is already happening, albeit perhaps at a preliminary stage, or albeit perhaps at a fairly low level.
Right. So the inquiry is now 8 months into its mandate. What have you found so far?
Well, I guess building on some of the comments that I've just made, what we're finding is three things. We're finding that environment, not only climate, but including often climate, is increasingly on the radar of the institutions that set the rules governing our financial system. Obviously, I've given examples from central banks, I've given examples from financial regulators. Stock exchanges increasingly are also taking up arms around environmental issues, principally by encouraging environmental risk management and associated disclosure. But also, we see that happening internationally. The Bank of International Settlements, perhaps not the most well-known bank and certainly not the most progressive institution out there on climate or broader environmental issues, has been challenged as to whether the new rules regarding capital requirements, so increasing capital requirements that banks have to hold in order to ensure that they're not taking too much risk, whether those rules are discouraging investment, for example, in renewables, where the evidence, although days are early, appears to be yes.
Right.
The Bank of International Settlements has no mandate to look at the environment, but are increasingly standing back and going, well, perhaps we should at least be undertaking some sort of policy stress test to see how what we are proposing, impacts on a whole range of other potential policy areas that are relevant to governments and central banks, including climate and broader environmental issues. So we're seeing stuff out there. That would be number one. Number two, I think we're seeing that emerging markets are doing more, are more engaged, and perhaps most importantly, have an appetite for something different, have an appetite for leading change in a different way. The China Banking Regulatory Commission, one of the 4 regulators in China, together with the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank Group, based out of Washington a few years ago, created something called the Sustainable Banking Network for Regulators, which was the first network of central bankers specifically set up to learn from each other about how they were dealing with environmental risk issues. Interestingly, in the first iterations, this network includes no OECD central banks at all.
Oh, really?
This is a pure emerging developing economy network. Deliberate, not deliberate, just drawing in folks who are interested in learning from China, Indonesia, Brazil, and others. You can take your own view, but it's a different period that we're moving into, where leadership is simply coming from a different place. And I think thirdly, and I think all these 3 things fit together, we're beginning to see a sort of more generic conversation about the future of the financial system beginning to play out more fully without necessarily an environmental or explicitly sustainability hat on. We see future of financial system initiatives emerging in many different places. The World Economic Forum has just announced the launch of the future of the financial system. The OECD is beginning a whole lot of work on that. Private players like PricewaterhouseCoopers has their own initiative on the future of the financial system. It's a time to step back after the financial crisis and ask what comes next. And of course, that isn't only an environmental question, but there are many other moving pieces. For example, do we really think that the banks of today will be around in their current form in 10 or 15 years' time with shifts in technology, massive moves on the big data front, significant disintermediation of many parts of the investment and banking value chain? So at the one time, we're trying to work out how to align today's financial system more effectively with environmental outcomes. On the other hand, the financial system itself is morphing very rapidly into something else.
Right.
So I think those three things we see quite clearly. We see a growing interest of environmental matters by folks who previously simply didn't see that as part of their day job. We see that leadership, particularly in emerging markets, although not exclusively coming out of emerging markets. And we see a kind of broader discussion about where the financial system is going, kind of sprouting from many, many different points in the system as that public debate begins to pick up speed.
So with all of this new awareness and interest in creating a sustainable financial system, what are the big barriers? What are the impediments that are restricting progress?
The list is long. But let me mention perhaps just two or three. So I think one is sheer complexity. Sheer complexity, dynamism, the rapid development in the way the financial sector evolves. Identifying suitable policy, regulatory and standards interventions into such a highly dynamic system is hard at the best of times,
right,
as we found post-2008. And it's perhaps particularly difficult where some of the risks and policy issues that we're trying to embed into the way financial systems work have a time horizon that extends beyond the dreams of most investors, and has a public goods element that makes it hard to capture the private benefit aspects and to incorporate that into asset valuation.
Right.
So I think finding the right way to intervene is pretty tricky. Secondly, I think that there are incumbent interests, unsurprisingly.
Right.
Again, we have seen that in the context of the financial crisis, completely devoid of anything to do with the environment at all. And those financial interests are largely driven by short-term gains. We see a vastly increasing proportion of what happens inside the financial sector focused on momentary volatility opportunities rather than shifts in capital that are responsive to real economy, productive and wealth-generating opportunities. And we see enormous commercial and other institutional interests protecting those sources of financial value added, even
right,
where they largely seem as if to be a rent on the real economy rather than a contribution to the real economy. Obviously, right, some of those vested interests are reconstructed into national interests and regional interests as we see governments protecting their own financial sectors,
right,
as major sources of tax, as major sources of employment, as major sources of political patronage. The volatile and almost violent debate about the financial transaction tax over the past few years, now perhaps silenced a little bit more, really illustrates how aggressively the financial sector can come out when it really doesn't like a set of proposals that are on the table.
Well, perhaps building on that, do you think that the current system can be reformed, or do we need something more radical, something much bolder, in order to create the system that you and others are envisioning?
Yeah, I was sitting this morning talking to one of the participants in the CG UNEP Inquiry academic symposium that we'll be running here over the next couple of days on this topic, someone from South Africa. And we were discussing the merits of the financial charter process, which was a long negotiation between the financial community, the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and COSATU, post-apartheid, to try and bring the financial sector more directly into play in supporting disadvantaged communities and black-owned businesses. And we were reflecting on whether the fact that financial charter process has delivered a greater outreach of new financial products to service poorer communities and individuals, whether that constitutes a legitimate success, or whether in fact that sort of was a substitute for a bigger discussion, which might have been about the power of the banking community, the merits of the level of competition that there was or wasn't in South Africa, the spreads that led to fairly high levels of profitability of the financial sector in South Africa. So one has that mixture of kind of nudge models where there are, if you like, tactical gains that are very real, and larger scale shifts that are clearly politically much more difficult, but might ultimately deliver more. I guess I would kind of just add into that, I think achieving those larger scale changes, certainly at an international level, seems almost inconceivable. Perhaps at a national level, in some instance, may be conceivable. But actually, some of those changes may come not through the activities of the UNEP Inquiry and similar initiatives, but come through the business model disruptions that will also reshape some of the very incumbent interest opportunities that exist today.
We've got a couple minutes left. And I want to come back to the inquiry itself. Anyone who has dealt with the UN knows that its track record is mixed, and that perhaps we should temper our expectations. Are you hopeful that this inquiry will be different, that this will lead to some real change?
So I would encourage you not to temper your expectations, but to be aggressively demanding for more. That would be the first thing. I think aiming low is never a good starting point for any venture. Secondly, I think the vision and practice of the inquiry is not to go research, find and propose, although that's clearly part of what we're doing, but to actively be part of processes of change on the ground. If we get to the end of the inquiry sometime at the end of next year and we have not been party to a process of change, then I think your concerned skepticism about the value of the inquiry would have been merited, because however good the product is, it will somehow be a product. I think the evidence 8 months through, which is where we are now, is really pretty good. I think we found, whether because of the way we've designed our work or because of the very fact that things are in change mode, we have found a considerable receptivity, not just to our message, but to our approach to exploring and taking forward the kind of policy and regulatory changes that make a difference. I have to say, I could hardly say something else, since I'm one of the co-directors of the inquiry. But 8 months through, I feel very positive about the possibilities of what the inquiry can contribute in practice on the ground to the agenda that it's trying to address.
Simon, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for being on the program. And thank you to our audience for watching this week's episode of Inside the Issues. If you are interested in learning more about the inquiry and the work it's doing, please consult www.unep.org or Simon's personal website, www.zadek.net. And please join us again for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Dr. Simon Zadek on the topic of a sustainable financial system. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week on the show, we're joined on Ban Ki-moon's UN panel on global sustainability. Can you say a little bit about that work?
Sure, yeah. So in the run-up to Rio +20,
Right.
UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon established one of what then turned out to be a number of different high-level panels. This one entitled the Global Sustainability Panel. In fact, your chairman, Jim Balsillie, was the private sector representative on the panel. And so I was drawn in to support Jim's work, in fact. And Jim's job was to not represent the interests of business, but to try and bring thinking from the business community and economics, I guess,
Right.
into the discussion. Firstly, what's the issue?
Right.
So the UNEP Inquiry was set up at the beginning of this year to really ask and try and answer one question. How can the financial system be better aligned to the needs of sustainable development? What does that
Right.
mean in practice?
Okay.
How can one influence the way in which credit is created and capital allocated in a way that takes account of environmental and broader sustainability effects of those financial flows? What's the situation at the moment? Well, capital markets are perhaps $275 trillion globally. We see environmental damage continuing.
By an expert in global governance, international affairs, or international public policy. Today, my guest is Dr. Simon Zadek. He is the co-director of the UNEP Inquiry. Among his many other affiliations, he is a senior fellow at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He's on the advisory board of the Generation Investment Management Group, and he is a senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Welcome to the show, Simon.
Thank you, Andrew.
Before we get into the UNEP project, I wonder if you could say a little bit about your previous work with CG. I understand you were brought on earlier to be part of the advisory group for Secretary General
of the panel. Interestingly, my main contribution and Jim's main pitch, if you like, on the panel concerned the subject that we're going to talk about for the rest of the half hour, which is, he argued the case that financial markets were a key part of the solution, that financial markets had flaws that rendered them unable to serve the interests of the sustainability agenda,
Right.
and that reform was needed. And in fact, some of that went into Ban Ki-moon's eventual report by the panel, but perhaps it wasn't the right moment in time.
Right. So just building on that, why now then? Why is UNEP all of a sudden interested in this issue?
Yeah, so